Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
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 Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them?
Togami.
Why don't you tell them? Why don't you tell them? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them?
Togami.
Why
Name's
don't you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's
Why don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell
Togami.
them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's
Why don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them?
Name's Byakuya
Why
Togami.
don't you
Name's
tell them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why
Name's
don't you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them?
Name's
Makoto?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them,
Name's Byakuya
Makoto?
Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's
Why
Byakuya
don't you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why
Name's
don't you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto?
Name's
Why don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them?
Name's
Makoto?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya
Makoto?
Togami.
Why don't you
Name's
tell
Byakuya
them?
Togami.
Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them?
Togami.
Makoto?
Name's
Why don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them? Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's
Makoto?
Byakuya
Why
Togami.
don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya
Makoto?
Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's
Why
Byakuya
don't you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you
Name's
tell
Byakuya
them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's
Why don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell
Name's
them?
Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you
Name's
tell
Byakuya
them?
Togami.
Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Name's Byakuya
Why don't
Togami.
you tell them,
Name's
Makoto?
Byakuya
Why
Togami.
don't you tell them,
Name's Byakuya
Makoto?
Togami.
Why don't you
Name's
tell them,
Byakuya
Makoto?
Togami.
Why don't
Name's
you
Byakuya
tell them,
Togami.
Makoto? Why
Name's
don't
Byakuya
you
Togami.
tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them,
Name's
Makoto?
Byakuya
Why
Togami.
don't you tell them?
Name's Byakuya Togami.
Why don't you tell them, Makoto? Why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Goodbye.